Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Services Ops podcast presented by Provus, the best podcast that digs into the people, process, and technology of all things services operations. We've got a great episode today, all about services sales. Everything you need to know in the next 25 minutes about services sales. And we've got the perfect guest to come talk about it. This is a veteran in the technology space, expert in services operations, and current CRO of Provus, Warren Bernstein. Mahesh, I think we got a really good guest today. What do you think?
Yes, and this is a special episode, Chris. This is our 10th episode. So we are getting into double digits now.
There you
And
go.
who better than Warren, whom I've had the luxury and opportunity to work with in multiple different instances. So super excited about today's episode.
Yeah, really exciting. The pressure's all on Warren to make number 10 fantastic. So how you doing, Warren?
I'm doing great and glad to be here and looking forward to chatting with the two of you.
Very cool. So before we really dive into the subject, why don't we hear just a little bit about yourself, Warren, a little bit about your background, and sort of how you got to Provus.
Well, that's an interesting journey. So I started my career with IBM. I started, and that's probably not only the start, but the middle. I spent 30 years there working across multiple businesses, multiple geographies, and always had an itch to leave that large multinational firm and put my fingerprints on something where I could make a difference. And the opportunity came up to join a product CPQ company called Aptus, now known as Conga in the industry. And I spent 4 years there, living through their growth cycle, going from a privately held company to a PE backed firm. And during that time, I actually crossed paths with Mahesh, and we had the opportunity to work closely together. And we talked late nights about the fact that a product CPQ solution was just not meeting the needs for many of our prospects and customers at Aptus. And Mahesh always told me that he was going to go off and start a services CPQ solution company, and I should join him. And little did I know, he'd actually go off and do it. So when the opportunity came about for me to join Mahesh, Mahesh reached out to me and said, "Why don't you come do this thing with me?" And so back in October, I had the opportunity to join Provus, and it's been everything I thought it would be. There is a great market for services CPQ solutions right now, and it's been underserved. So I'm thrilled to be here, and came away of 30 years with IBM, and then getting into the whole startup world. But it's great to be in an industry where there is a huge opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what makes you really, really uniquely qualified for this subject in this podcast is that not only are you a pro salesperson, right? You've managed organizations and you know what it takes to think about technology, the people, the processes to make revenue just go. But you are talking to so many services leaders on a day in, day out basis about Provus, yes, but also about their greater challenges, what they're seeing in the market, how they're solving their problems. So that's what I'm really excited to talk to you about today and kind of pull that out. So I think, as we go through this episode, we're going to talk about a few things, right? We're going to talk about what we're seeing. We're going to talk about AI, of course. But first, I'd love to get your insight on the first 6 months of the calendar year, right? We're about halfway through, almost official. And boy, what a year it's been for everybody in the services sales orgs, right? What are you seeing? What are some of the biggest challenges or trends that you've seen so far? And Mahesh, you as well. I mean, every single day you're talking to services sales leaders. Biggest trends you're seeing so far this year, and what do you kind of maybe see happening in the back half of this calendar year?
Sure. I'm happy to start, and then I'll throw it over to Mahesh. From my perspective, I think, the reality is companies are managing their spend throughout the first 6 months this year with interest rates, with the unknown political environment here in the US. There's a great focus on ensuring that every dollar spent has a return. And so while the money is being spent in this industry, there's a constant look for value, right? What are the outcomes that I'm going to get from my spend? And so it's really important as a sales organization that we we don't talk about the underlying technology. We talk about the outcomes that that underlying technology will bring. And I think that's really important. I think what's going to happen as we move through the year, certainly with the political landscape and election November, I don't think we're going to see a huge change, certainly in the third quarter. I think the fourth quarter has an opportunity where there's probably some unspent capital out there. And I think we have the opportunity to see more spending as the year ends. So right now, I've got my team focused on really making sure that we're driving value propositions and really making sure that we can tie those to our customers' needs.
And I think to add to that, Chris, I think, while Warren talked about a broader perspective of where the services sales industry is, kind of narrowing it down from there in terms of what we are seeing is AI is no longer a buzzword only, right? While I think it's at the beginning part of the journey when it comes to AI and how and what it really means in your lead to cash transformation journey. But there are ample signs that AI is real, it's here to stay, and it's here to solve a really mission critical problems for the customers. Talking about services sales, talking about services CPQ or services quoting, which is what we do here at Provus, there are some amazing use cases that otherwise it's impossible for a human being to really effectively negotiate or understand the data, understand the delta between your sold margins and realized margins, understand how you can potentially maximize your revenue and optimize your margins without really creating a delivery risk on a 3-year, 5-year, kind of a proposal and stuff like that, right? So this is where AI is no longer a buzzword, but what we have seen with mid-market to enterprise customers is there is almost a mandate that if you are in the process of purchasing a new software asset, then it either has to have a AI solution or a AI roadmap, or it has to have something to do with the AI that's going to solve some part of the business problem, right? And I think that's very exciting. That's really creating a what I would call a pull factor in terms of services CPQ or services quoting, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I think to your point, Mahesh, there's just so much data that goes into a services quote. There's so many different iterations of how do I get the right labor from the right delivery center at the right margin, that without advanced analytics and AI capabilities, what's becoming just very real in the marketplace is an understanding that spreadsheets just won't get it there. And it's not that spreadsheets can't do some of the work, but the data, and it's not information, it's data. The data can't be accumulated in a way for AI engines to actually get information out of it and provide value. And that's one of the real keys I see in the services space is everyone's got just a wealth of data. And we're now hitting the wall where to turn the crank, to get that next 1% margin return, you have to rely on AI and advanced analytics to be able to get these kind of returns.
Yeah. And Warren, to that extent, while you are solving really mission critical problems for your customers, I'm curious, what are you doing internally? How is your sales team, managing your proposals, and how are they optimizing those deals?
Yeah, and that's, it comes back to the what is it, the old cobbler's children or shoemaker's children, right? You're using your own capabilities, and that's something that we really try and do here at Provus. So we talk about Provus on Provus, and how do we go and talk to our customers and talk about what it would take to deliver not only our technology, but the entire solution. So when we start building out that solution, we look at how do we configure that and how do we create a quote. And we try and walk the talk, if you will, with our customers by using Provus on Provus for our estimates and our quotes.
That's great. That's great. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love you guys dove straight into AI. And I love let's pull it back just a little bit because you guys said some really, really big important things there, right? Warren, you talked about outcomes. and what are you trying to accomplish? So once again, AI as an initiative, it's here, it's important, it's not just a buzzword, but in the services sales role, right, as a sales leader or even just a field level sales rep, help us understand what are you seeing as opportunities or needs for services sales organizations to do to really take advantage of AI? What are they trying to accomplish, number one, with it as a strategy? Because like you said, everybody's being tight with their spend, but we still have an initiative in place to make advancements with the way you operate from a sales organization. So how do you suggest teams kind of balance that working through tight wallets as well as advancing your capabilities as a sales organization? Why does AI matter to sales organizations?
Yeah, I think it starts, and I try and break it down. I actually look at the market, and I look at how we implement our technology, our solution with our customers. And I think you got to look at it from three perspectives. You have to, as I talked about, you have to look at it from a data perspective. How do you get the data in a way that you can first acquire it, then organize it, then secure it, and finally distribute it? Because you've got to distribute it to different systems, right? You have a CRM solution, you have a PSA solution, you have the Provus core capabilities that need that data to start producing those outcomes. So the first is, how do I collect the data across my organization and across the area that I'm working in? The second piece is picking the right technologies that can take that data and start creating value from it, right? And then finally, and this is probably most important, and I learned this during my career at IBM. I did an assignment overseas, and during that assignment, I was part of one of the IBM's business units that just had a wealth of data. And what I realized is that if you could harness that data and start understanding it, you could start making decisions. But that goes against a lot of things in human nature, because now you've got to create a culture. You're actually going to trust the data, and you're going to trust the things and the results that data gives you. And you got to be willing to trust that I'm going to make decisions now based on what I learned there. And so there's like a three-part process here when I think about what happens within services and when the services quoting space is, first, I need to be able to get to the data. I need to, as Ms. Hesh had talked about, I need to be able to not only look at what did I quote, but I need to be able to look at the actuals, right? What did I deliver? Was my project underwater, or did it actually do well on it? And too many organizations today don't draw that correlation, right? Once I have that data, then what's the right technologies to really harness what's in there and turn the data into information? And then how do I create that ongoing culture? And I would argue it starts from the top. If your organization leadership doesn't believe in a cultural shift using data to make decisions, then all the other pieces start falling apart. And so that's something that, here at Provus, we take very seriously. It starts with Mahesh. We try and make data-driven decisions. Our entire platform is built on a data-driven architecture. All those components allow us then to start delivering the capabilities and functionality and really ultimately the outcomes that our customers are looking for.
Yeah. And Mahesh, I think, from my experience running operations functions, I always find field level data is the hardest to collect because you have to depend a lot on people. And it's a collaboration with leaders at the top, and you're like, hey, we need your people to be better at giving us data. Like, they need to take more time out of their day to like enter it this way and do it this way and do it that way so we can actually help there. So as a leader, how do you come up with a plan to help explain like the pain we're putting you through now, sales field, it's gonna be better for you in the future because why, right? Like AI, what does that mean? Like, why should they care? Why should they care that they have to do their role to then to kind of see this data dream happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. The answer is fairly simple because in services, everything is about your margins, right? And services run on optimizing margins, and 0.5% of margin means that you have to make it up about 8 to 10% on the top line if you lose that margin, which means that it's not always or and only about the project execution that you have to make the right decisions. You have to make the right decisions way upfront in terms of how you are selling it, right? Which also makes it very compelling to say that, hey, let's not rely on Excel spreadsheets. Let's not rely on Google spreadsheets. Let's not rely on tribal knowledge of your sales teams across the board. Now, tribal knowledge is important because that's feeding into how AI is going to learn, but that's not the only decision-making point that you have, right? That's one aspect. The second is selling services has become more and more complex for enterprises, right? And so is the consuming of services. The customers have become more aware, more smarter. They want to understand the total cost of ownership upfront, and any deviation from that total cost of ownership means that they have to go through multiple different approval cycles internally again for change orders and for change in schedule. And something that what we do at Provus, which is the services coding, is fully integrated into your front office and back office, which means that any delays or any changes or anything that you have missed on the scope is going to end up resulting in not only your project, but it's going to end up resulting in kind of massive impact across the board, across your lead to cash process automations, right? And as a result of that, how you sell services from a scope perspective, from timeline perspective, from scheduling perspective, from optimizing your scope and resource mix to make sure that your delivery risk is well understood at the beginning of the project is why you can no longer rely on Excel spreadsheet. That's why you need the process automation. Now that you have addressed the process automation for larger customer of ours, enterprise customers, and we have seen, all kinds of Excel spreadsheet at this point in time. I mean, Excel spreadsheet that's mile long, Excel spreadsheet with, 30 different tabs, Excel spreadsheet with tremendously complex formulas that no one can really understand, right? All of that kind of stuff. And yet you are now making a decision on your $15 million, $10 million, 3-year deal based on either a tribal knowledge or relying on some sort of Excel spreadsheet formulas, or based on what you are hearing from the customer. You have no real insight saying that, should I be happy about selling at 55% margin, not knowing that I'm going to only realize 43% margin because I've underestimated the whole thing based on 100 other projects that I've already done, that data already exists, but I just don't have a way to consume it. This is where AI and advanced analytics and AI really comes in, because like I said, the services is all about your margins, and 0.5% of margin can make a lot of difference. Like, I won't quote the customer, but one of our large enterprise customers, the chief operating officer said, the entire ROI, and this is a very large customer of ours, and the entire ROI of Provus will be covered if we are able to optimize a 3-year deal with a 0.5% point. That's the impact we are talking about. Now, you can optimize the margins mathematically speaking, but that's not effective. That doesn't work on a 3-year large $15 million deal. You have to really understand scope, your work breakdown structure, your resources, your resource locations, your resource mix, your productivity gains and losses, your ramp up of your resources, the scheduling of your different services that you are going to provide. And all of that just, makes it impossible for a human being to make the right decisions, which is where AI comes in.
And Mahesh, to your point, the leaders in the industry recognize that, and recognize that there's a journey to being able to deliver those results immediately. And what I mean by that, I was actually on with a prospect earlier today, and we were having this exact conversation, and we're talking about outcomes and what would 1% of margin mean if you had the ability to create an entire quote and then have a goal seek feature where you could say, okay, I would like to see that work breakdown structure, but with 1% more margin. How long would it take to develop that? And we got through the entire discussion, and the executive on the call said, that is something that I would like tomorrow. And I asked the next question, is your data collected in a way today that I could produce that for you tomorrow? And we paused and agreed that we need to have a crawl, walk, run approach. But the crawl, walk, run approach starts with a solution like Provus. You've got to start collecting that information, doing those comparisons, and then the value of AI back to, is AI buzzword or is it something I can deliver on? And that was the exact conversation we had, is that the longer organizations stay on spreadsheets, it's just a nice discussion because there's no way to capture that information and harness that value.
Yeah. Yeah. And Warren, we've talked about sort of your thought on what AI can do to enable a sales team. And you have a little bit of a different take on it. It's more than just time savings. And Mahesh just laid out a really great picture of an extremely complex situation where if you're in the sales org for services, you need to know a lot of things. You need to know a lot of things, you need to think about a lot of things, and you got to be very sure with what your customer's experience is going to be like if they say yes, right? So I think you had a really interesting concept of personalization, using AI for personalization and what that means from outcomes in sales work. So I'd love for you to kind of dig into that and explain what you mean there.
Yeah, and I think it all starts with the focus that sellers spend, the time they spend with their prospects, right? And too often they get lost in the weeds and aren't solving larger issues, larger problems, opportunities, as we like to say in sales. There are no problems, there's just opportunities. And when you start looking at how AI can start building the science part of a quote, right? We like at Provus to talk about the art and the science. And very often we talk about every customer is unique and everything needs to be bespoke. But when you actually step back and start thinking about how a quote is created, we actually all start with some fundamental principles about the services that we're going to provide. And if I can start looking at that as the science part of quoting, and then free up time for our sellers to work the art, and whether that seller is an AE or whether that seller is a services practitioner, the goal here is to get them to focus on the customer's needs and really understand them. And that's the art. And that's when the services quote that gets delivered to the customer becomes that much more valuable. When we spend all our time in the weeds trying to do a one-off and build it from scratch every time, we very often lose the bigger picture of what problem are we actually trying to solve. And so one of the things that I look at just in Provus is the scalability of a solution, right? When I bring in new resources into Provus, how do they get them up to speed? Well, if I can take some percent of our quoting process and make it more scientific, it allows them to be flexible and really understanding the customer needs, right, from a starting point. And that starting point can be 40% of the quote, all the way up to maybe 70 to 80% of the quote if it's a repeatable process. And for those that aren't repeatable, it doesn't have to be 80%. But if I can put some, I like to say, guardrails into that quoting process, and that may be guardrails that I built in from an approval perspective. It may be guardrails that my AI engine start making recommendations based on the quote that they see. They can start making those recommendations so that my seller now has the ability to determine what's going to be most effective for the opportunity and for the client. And that takes me full circle to something that I firmly believe in, which is we spend too much time talking about individual contracts when we talk about customers. You've all heard me say this often. The concept of a total contract value, TCV, I think has to be replaced with total customer value. And that starts during the sales process. If we can really look at it from what's going to make the customer most effective, you start driving customer value, not an individual sale. So I think AI has a real strong value proposition in selling. It's got to be used appropriately. It won't be the answer for everything, but it certainly can jumpstart or fast start the process and really help you make some complex recommendations to help you make the right decisions.
Yeah. And this is my own personal high horse. And what I like about what you said is we're not talking about AI to garner more time for selling, right? We're not saying implement AI so you can get rid of repetitive tasks. Implement this so you're better at calendaring, whatever it's going to be, or expense management, whatever. We're not talking about in this conversation about using AI in a services sales org so that you can have more sales time, so you can have more prospecting time. We're talking about scaling your personalization for your customers so that they can have better value at the end of it, better outcomes for everybody, right? Revenue comes through, margins comes through. You don't have to have as high top line revenue, which is important because let's look at the second half of the year. As we said at the beginning, things are tight, right? And they're unknown. So are we going to try and fill our gaps with top line revenue as a sales strategy? Might not be the smart, I mean, give your own personal recommendation. I might not make that your core strategy for the second half of 2024 for growth right now. Still try really hard, but you might not want to do that.
Yeah, but I'd say they're inextricably tied together.
Yeah.
When you understand what your customer is trying to accomplish, you can drive that revenue growth for you as a solution provider. But if you come at it the other way, which is how am I going to drive more time selling as compared to more time understanding?
Mm-hmm.
I had a father-in-law that always used to say, there's a reason that God gave us two ears and one mouth, right? It's all about listening, right? And when you listen to your customer, right, that's when you start really being able to drive value. And so I'm a big believer that that's how you have to think about AI. AI is not going to replace us all. AI is not going to be giving us answers for every solution, but AI can certainly enhance that process and create value for us in front of our clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you start winning more sales, and then everybody is happy. Look at that. That's all that's all the motivation a sales teams need.
That's
Like,
it. That's it.
we'll win more. Awesome. Well, we're just at about time. Before we go, we like to give a couple recommendations or takeaways before we leave. So let's start off with Mahesh. You know, thinking about this conversation, thinking about how services sales organizations should be approaching the second half of the year. What do you think is one key takeaway that our audience should have?
I think one key takeaway is if you are on Excel spreadsheet, think about where you are spending time. Think about how many times have you have thought like, oh God, I wish I had insights into what Warren called it TCV, the total kind of customer value, right? And how I could help customer more and better and faster, so that, I sign the deal and the next conversation I'm having is about change order because, I missed something or they misunderstood something or they did not understand the scope or, all of that kind of stuff, right? Nobody wants that. Nobody likes that. And in the sales process, more upfront, transparent you can be, it's better for everyone. Part of total customer value is the experience, right? That you put the customer through in a multi-month, multi-year journey. And that's the key. So if you're on Excel spreadsheet, ask yourself a question like how many times you felt that, I mean, incentive or commission is one part, but how many times you felt that I wish I could really maximize my revenue in an efficient way rather than me spending a lot of time on Excel spreadsheet and going, from tab to tab and this inputs and stuff like that. How I wish that I had a magical tool, which was more of, I would say, guided quoting kind of a thing where I'm just spending little amount of time, but I'm spending more time really with the customer, understanding their needs and really less time, tweaking and doing stuff on my Excel spreadsheet. I think if you're in that boat, I think you have to raise your hand with whoever in your organization and say, hey, I'm not going to put up with this Excel spreadsheet anymore.
Nice. Great advice. And Warren, to close out the second half of 2024, what should organizations be thinking about?
Well, they certainly should be thinking about Provus and how can we help their needs. But no, seriously, look, I actually am a big believer that leadership comes with the walk and talk that we as leaders show within our organization. And as we talked about here today, there's a huge opportunity to address services quoting needs and to address it with solutions that take advantage of AI capabilities. But that fundamentally requires leadership around creating and cultivating a cultural change, and that change is focused on making data-driven decisions. We can enable all of that with technology, but if the culture isn't open to embracing it, it won't happen. And so as leaders within organizations, I would strongly encourage everyone, think about what you're doing day to day. Are you asking your teams, Chris? You talked about filling out, spreadsheets and whatnot. Are you actually using the information? Is the information or the data that's in those spreadsheets, can you capture it in a way to make decisions for the organization based on what's there? And I think what you'll find is too often we're talking the talk, we may not be walking the walk. And so I think creating that culture, that cultivating, how am I going to get at the data? How am I going to make sure that I'm making decisions because my team and our delivery teams are capturing data that we can now make decisions for our business on. So that would be the challenge I'd put before everyone is what are we doing to enable change?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And really quick, one last closing thought is the data you're talking about collecting, it's not for answering interesting questions about yourselves internally. It's not about like which region does this and what's our sales cycle length. The data is not about answering questions about regional effectiveness or something there. Like that stuff's important. Org structure is important. But when you guys are talking about collecting data, it's in the service of these customer outcomes, it's in the service of revenue and margin outcomes, right?
That's right.
Not fun to have data. So when you're telling your teams to have these data-driven decisions, make sure you're very clear about why you're collecting it, what that data is in service of, right? It's not in service to make you miserable. It's not in service to be like, you're not doing enough. It's in service to help the organization have positive revenue and margin outcomes. That's what we're talking about. You do that, then you're on the right cultural path in your services sales organization.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that is all the time we have for this episode. This has been fantastic. In case anybody wants to learn more about Warren or Provus, provusinc.com, of course. But thank you everybody for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Don't forget, be bold, drive change, think about your total customer value, and go off and have a good day.